Newcastle United returned to Premier League action against Fulham on Saturday in what could arguably be the biggest game of the season so far in terms of the crossroads of where they go. In this video I'm going to be reacting to Sandro Tonali's new contract news, discussing Arne Slot's dig at Newcastle United over Alex Isak, and also discussing who should start in the game at St James's Park on Saturday. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Before we get going, as usual, please do hit subscribe and like on this video if you haven't already. You can also join me with the link in the description on Patreon for extra content. You can get that after a 7-day free trial for $4.99 a month. There's player ratings, there's previews from games. There's also going to be some more content from mailbags and your thoughts, more interaction. You can get all of that down below. You can also support me for ad-free versions of these videos for $2.99 a month as well, if you so please. But please do, if you haven't already, subscribe over on YouTube, because it really helps the content and really helps my channel grow, and I really appreciate all of your support. But yeah, let's get straight into talking about Sandro Tonali first, because I've done a couple of videos on this, and I think I've written about it as well, that it's important to get him signed down to a new contract. And David Hopkinson came in as the new CEO, and also Ross Wilson coming in as sporting director. The first thing, or one of the top things on their agendas, will have been Sandro Tonali's contract. But it turns out that was never the case, because he's already signed a new deal secretly around the time of his ban, I think, that's extended his contract effectively till 2030, because Newcastle have a unilateral option on an extra year, which will protect his value even further. So it effectively means that Newcastle have Sandro Tonali down for 5 years, which is a huge relief off the back of the Alex Isak stuff. Obviously, I've spoken about his future. I've spoken about the fact that other clubs are going to be waking up to how good he is, because that's really the big thing. I think it kind of happened with Isak, where once he became overall known across the Premier League in a strange way, once everybody started watching him, it became inevitable that he would be leaving, or there would be an immense interest from not just Liverpool, who obviously signed him, but Arsenal and Barcelona and other clubs abroad. Once he hit that really rich run of form and scored those goals against Arsenal in the league, Arsenal in the cup, Liverpool, obviously the cup final goal, it felt like something shifted, and the fans from other clubs started watching him. And actually, and we'll talk on this in a little bit, because we've got Arne Slot to cover as well, because he's had some words to say about Newcastle, which I think I just have to talk about because it just feels so wrong to me, but we'll get into that in a minute. But yeah, Tonali's kind of ready for the same trajectory. I think it's more difficult for the type of midfielder that he is, because you don't really see, when you watch Newcastle, you don't really see Tonali be the dominant force. Only when you watch them closely, like everybody here does, when you watch them every week, you see what Tonali brings. But if you're watching highlight packages or games on TV, you'll not see what Tonali brings all the time, because he helps Newcastle tick along. He plays the ball to Bruno, who might make the big pass, who might make the big decisive moment in the game more often than Tonali. But Tonali is the most crucial player that Newcastle have, that we all understand that, I think. So it's massive that he's signed this contract, because one, it shows that he is absolutely loving it at Newcastle, but also shows that he really still felt very guilty about the whole situation. There's also, I think it was Craig Hope was saying that he went to Newcastle and suggested a reduction in his wages while the ban was on, and I think that's a really interesting insight into his character. I've spoken to Sandro Tonali a few times in the mix zone, and that's a very small glimpse of what you get out of a player, but you do get to understand the type of person that he is. He's very calm. He's very introverted. I think that was sort of misinterpreted when he arrived, because people thought that he didn't want to be there, but that's just the way he is. But you can tell he's a very emotional person, and you can tell he's very connected to what Newcastle have done for him. I think he is quite surprised, I think, as well, how the fans have taken to him, because I don't think he expected that beyond what he got at Milan, which is obviously his club. And we spoke last time, he had some comments to say about his future on international duty, maybe going back to Italy at some point. I think he will end his career in Italy. I think he will probably play for AC Milan again. He would like to play for AC Milan again. I think Newcastle have got to understand that. Isak had 3 years on his contract, so the length of contract isn't everything, but to have Tonali tied down to Newcastle for the next 5 years in effect is absolutely massive. It's also really impressive from a Dan Ashworth perspective because, lots of people criticised him and what did he do really? What he had left Newcastle to go to Manchester United without seeing what he'd done come to fruition. But I think this is one example of his understanding and of his the way he works being really impressive. I think the fact that he got this contract signed at that time was really, really good, and it's come and helped Newcastle at a crucial point when we're all feeling a little bit vulnerable about where Newcastle's star players go if Newcastle don't qualify for the Champions League. It doesn't mean that Tonali won't want to leave if that happens. It doesn't mean that Tonali won't leave. But the fact this has come out now really does help. I think it's absolutely incredible news. And the next on the list is probably Sven Botman and or Tino Livramento. I think that's what we spoke about the other week, and that is the case. Given that Sven Botman was at Liverpool recently, I think he's been also linked by Leverkusen, which was probably not likely to happen given where they are now, and his fitness looks back to the levels it was pre knee injuries, and he just looks like that player again. He's been linked with Liverpool, he's been linked with other clubs. I'm sure he may be looking at this if his contract isn't renewed to say that, well, I could get a move, I could get better money, I could get whatever. That's how these things work. So the next thing's got to be Botman, but also Livramento being linked with Manchester City in the summer. He's played for England at both left back and right back. He's a really, really versatile, impressive player. Obviously, Newcastle are really missing him for obvious reasons at the moment with his injury. So those two things are really important next. But absolutely huge news that Sandro Tonali has signed a new contract at Newcastle, or did 2 years ago, which now keeps Newcastle well in control of this situation. And hopefully, as I've mentioned in the last couple of videos, on a personal level, they openly acknowledge what Tonali's done. They openly acknowledge that they need to deal with this better. If they offer the idea of a better contract, they have to honour it. Don't do it unless you can. Both Amanda Staveley and Paul Mitchell were equally culpable in my mind around the Isak situation. Newcastle have got to manage this much better, but their hand has just been hugely strengthened by the news this week that Sandro has signed a new contract. So that's really, really good. Next thing we are going to talk about is Arne Slot making what seemed like a little dig at Newcastle, calling them a small club, around the fact that Isak wasn't training with Newcastle. He said there's a big difference between training at a small club and training at Liverpool. It's only interpretation that makes that a dig at Newcastle, but it's hard to really argue against it at the same time. So we are going to discuss it, and we're going to discuss what Liverpool have got with Alexander Isak. I know probably a lot of you guys won't want to hear me talk about an ex-player, but I just think that it's such a big thing. I've got to come out and talk about it and almost defend Newcastle with this, because it wasn't Newcastle's fault that Alexander Isak decided to strike. We know he is paying for this because he's made this decision to do this. Newcastle didn't hold him to ransom. They had a price. Liverpool refused to budge. There wasn't a bid on the table until right at the end. So there was game playing on both sides. And I said on a podcast this week, I actually think Newcastle and Liverpool have both paid a little bit of a price in different ways. Voltemada's come in and been absolutely fantastic up front for Newcastle. But the Ekitike Isak couple of days, if that had gone a different way and Newcastle had signed Ekitike and Liverpool had signed Isak, you'd probably have Isak training from the start and hitting the ground running and being in better form from the start of this season, and not having any of these issues. And you'd have Ekitike playing for Newcastle, and Newcastle probably being a lot stronger at the start of the season as well, because they wouldn't have to adapt to a new style of player. I think Nick Voltemada himself has done absolutely brilliant. That's not a slight on him, but we've seen how the team is adapting to him, whereas Ekitike is very similar to Isak. That you would think that whole thing would be a lot more seamless. That's just a theory that I have. Let me know in the comment section if you agree with it. But also, this is just kind of what Isak is like. He's had the equivalent of a pre-season now since he's been at Liverpool, and he's played enough games. I think he's played as many games as you would in pre-season, and Arne Slot said last week that he's fully fit. You can judge him now, and he's just not playing very well. And there are sort of style issues in terms of how do you play Isak next to Salah or next to Gakpo, who are not going to assist him. First and foremost, he's not the main man that he was at Newcastle, but also then how is the dynamic with Ekitike and how are you going to fit one of those two players in? The analogy that Liverpool fans like to use is that they are like Ferraris, and you pick one at the garage and they're both going to do superbly well, but the difference is a Ferrari doesn't get upset if you don't use it. That's what the problem with Liverpool are having in the early weeks with Isak is. but he's not a very durable footballer. We know that as well. So I think Liverpool have to be patient with Isak. He obviously will come good, but the whole thing with Arne Slot criticising Newcastle, what were Newcastle supposed to do apart from the Ekitike dynamic that I just mentioned? When Liverpool actually were the ones who chose to sign Ekitike, which took Newcastle's main alternative out of the situation, they had to go and react and do something different. I don't see how Newcastle can be criticised for the way that they acted when Isak was the one who was refusing to train. If Isak had trained and played for Newcastle in pre-season at the start of the season, he would have then left if he'd got his move. And I do appreciate that maybe he wouldn't. That's the argument at the time. But if he'd got his move, then he would have been fully fit for Liverpool. But this is just Isak, as we said, he had difficult times last season at the back end, but with his form and fitness, whether that's had something to do with the fact that he was thinking about his move, whatever it was, but he did have tough times at the end of last season. He's having tough times now. Often he's quite streaky in some ways. He's incredibly consistent when the setting is right. But Newcastle had the setting perfectly right between December and March last season. Everything was geared towards getting the best out of Isak, and he reacted, and he is unstoppable when that happens. But that's going to be very difficult for him to find at Liverpool because not everything will be geared towards him. So a lot of the issues that Liverpool are having with Isak, I think they haven't understood and they haven't appreciated. And also Arne Slot has made some pretty silly comments, in my opinion, criticising Newcastle in this, because there was nothing that Newcastle had to do. They didn't owe Alexander Isak anything, they didn't owe Liverpool anything. The deal wasn't on the table, and also their first alternative was taken away from them. So what else were they supposed to do? Let me know in the comment section what you think, if you can stomach still talking about Alexander Isak some weeks later. Finally, though, we will talk about Saturday and the game against Fulham, who've lost 3 games in a row. They're in really poor form. They're a good team. It's a good time to play them. They've got no Rodrigo Muniz up front as well. So this is a good opportunity for Newcastle to regain momentum in the Premier League season. And I said at the start, this is a really important game because it has a sort of crossroads feel to it in the Premier League. There's a run of fixtures that are quite winnable for Newcastle. They need to pick up points to regain momentum. They're currently in the bottom half of the Premier League while doing really well in the Champions League, and that was reflected. Obviously, we spoke about talking about Anthony Gordon's form, Harvey Barnes' form, all the wingers doing really well in the Champions League and not the Premier League, but that has to be reflected in the whole team as well. The whole team has to do that too, and I think this is a huge game. I'm recording this before Eddie Howe's presser, so when I go through my team that I think he'll pick, I'm doing so without knowing what he said in his presser. There will be a presser reaction quotes piece on Forbes later, but this is the team I've gone for, and it's very similar to Tuesday's win over Benfica. Pope in goal, Byrne, Botman, Chow and Trippier in defence. The only bone of contention, I think, is Jacob Ramsey over Joelinton, and I think Ramsey did deserve his place. I think, as I said, on Tuesday, every single time he got the ball, he moved it forward, and this is a game where Fulham are not going to come and dominate the ball. And Fulham have proved a difficult team to break down in the last few years. Newcastle obviously needed a late winner in 2023. They obviously then did, get over the line with the 3-0 win in December 2023 as well. But I was at that game and it was actually quite nervy for quite a long time. Fulham did cause problems on the counter-attack. Last year they obviously won 2-1 as well. So Fulham are going to be a difficult team to break down. You need players who are going to drive forward, look forward every single time. In terms of when they get the ball, they're going to pass it forward, they're going to run forward. That's exactly what Jacob Ramsey brings. I don't think they need the physicality of Joelinton to impose themselves as much in this game. So what I've spoken about is certain games being where Ramsey's a better choice than Joelinton. I would say at the moment that's the case form-wise as well. I think Joelinton reacted fairly well to his disappointing performance against Brighton, but not well enough to usurp Ramsey, who I thought was really impressive in the first half. So Ramsey goes in at left side of the midfield. Bruno obviously on the right hand side, and Tonali does come back if he's well enough to, because he didn't. I saw him in the players' entrance the other day and he did not look well. So if he is well enough to play, he comes in for Louis Miley. We obviously spoke about Miley needing a bit more definition on Tuesday, but there's no way that he usurps Tonali. I think nobody would usurp Tonali if Tonali's fit enough. Gordon, can he finally pick up in the Premier League from where he left off on Tuesday on the left? Jacob Murphy on the right, obviously no real question about that, because Anthony Elanga is finding it so difficult, I think, at the moment. And also Harvey Barnes, yes, impressive with 2 goals, but I think he needs to play from the bench to have his best impact. I don't know, he won't like to hear that, but That's what we've seen in Newcastle. I don't think he would start with as much energy and as much tactical understanding of what's required of that role as Jacob Murphy does on the right hand side, and then obviously Nick Voltemada up front, scoring goals, doing really well. But I think this is going to be a huge game for Newcastle. I think they will win the game. I think they'll go for a 2-0 victory, but a massive occasion for Newcastle. Need to get victory to regain some momentum ahead of a cup game, which is where the changes I think will be rung against Spurs and also West Ham. I am recording this before the presser, just as a reminder, and apologies for my voice. I'm not particularly well at the moment as well, but like, share and subscribe. I'll be back from St James's Park on Saturday afternoon with my instant reaction, and the video will come out on Sunday. Thanks so much for joining me. Like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you then. Cheers.